busted. So today's video is kind of a video response to some comments that I got on my last video and on some of my shorts. I appreciate all your guys' comments. Keep them coming. And I just figured that making a video is a good way to respond to some of those. One of the comments that I got was, I'd rather worm my sheep than do amp grazing. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. So let's talk today a little bit about continual grazing and just utilizing worm medicines and some of the issues that you can have with that. There's some benefits to it, so maybe we should talk about the benefits first. Administering the medications to your sheep is pretty simple and straightforward. It acts pretty quick on your sheep as long as you give them the right dosage and the right kind of medication that they need. A lot of times it actually requires some testing to find out what the sheep actually have, what kind of parasites they have. So the medication is fairly straightforward, and there's not really a lot of downside to just administering the medication. You know, you got to catch them, but if you got handling equipment, you know, if you're doing continual grazing or you're just running in a barn or something, you probably have all that. It's probably going to be pretty simple for you. It's a lot more challenging for me to catch some of mine out here. The friendly ones that come up to me are pretty simple to catch, but the other ones that are not quite as tame are going to be a lot more challenging. I kind of got to trick them with some grain or something, get their mind on something else, and then I'll catch them with the shepherd's crook. But yeah, the medication's fairly straightforward, but some of the problems that you can have with the medication is you're going to get some parasite resistance. It's something that all the vets are going to tell you all about. You know, our area, there's definitely some resistance to most of the medications that people are using nowadays. So I've heard plenty of them not even suggesting to use it to just cull sheep that are overcome with parasites. And I don't know if I'd exactly agree with those sentiments, but there's definitely some parasite resistance that happens. The more we utilize the medication, especially when it's not needed, the more resistance you're going to start to see. Continual grazing is probably the simplest way, at least at first, to get into grazing any kind of livestock. You don't have to move them around too much. You don't have to really do anything. You got to make sure they got water, you got to make sure they got a fence around their area, and that's about it. So continual grazing versus amp grazing, the labor time initially is going to seem like it's a lot less to go the continual grazing route. So I could see why people would not really be interested in doing amp grazing or a managed rotational grazing of any kind. But now let's talk about some of the benefits of amp grazing. Wherever your sheep are grazing, they're dropping manure. I think we can all agree on that. The higher concentration of sheep you have in an area, the more manure. And what else is going to be in that manure? Well, they already have some parasites that are going to be hatching out from that manure. Look at all these dragonflies. I don't know if you guys will be able to see that from the video, but so any high concentration of sheep, you're going to have a real high concentration of manure. Now if you're doing continual grazing, the sheep are going to move around inside the paddock that you gave them for whatever the specified amount of time is, and they're going to go back and forth seeking out their favorite foods. This paddock right here, this is one day, and you can see the manure load that we have in here. Now the problem with continual grazing is the sheep are going to continue to go back to areas that they've already been to. So imagine they spend part of a day in this area, but you know, continual grazing, they're going to have a huge area to roam in for however long, a matter of weeks, months, whatever it might be. The problem being is that you're going to have parasites hatching out in that manure and just sitting there waiting to reinfect a host. So your sheep, your cows, they're going to come back to an area like this to come back and find, you know, after a few days, after a week, they're going to want to come back to an area to look and see if there's any more of their favorite foods growing in that spot. And what are they going to find? They might find some new growth, but they're also going to find some parasite larvae. And they're going to ingest those. And those are going to reinfect the sheep. And this begins a really dangerous, unhealthy cycle for the sheep of a really high parasite load. And this is exactly what I'm trying to avoid with my sheep. Now there's definitely a lot of manure around, and look at all this dung beetle activity. All right, that's another thing. You would not see the dung beetle activity out here if you were using worm medications constantly. Why is that? Because the worm medications will kill all of the beneficial insects that we need to keep this ecosystem going. The comment about, I'd rather worm my animals, well, I appreciate that. You're not going to have this kind of activity everywhere you look. So how does that better your farm? How does that improve your soil? It doesn't. Matter of fact, all it's doing is slowly killing it. So while we have more work to do on a daily basis on most days, to move these guys, and I'm getting ready to move them again here, the benefits everywhere I look are pretty obvious. It's dung beetle activity and other insects that are breaking this stuff down. And the point is, those dung beetles are breaking this stuff down, and it's going back and it's feeding the soil. Yeah, she gets it. When we first bought this property, it was a hayfield. And it was pretty much stripped bare. There was hardly any grass growing. We had, you know, bare soil everywhere. You would not dare step outside, you know, out in the grass with bare feet, because it was like walking on thorns. It was like walking on little sticker bushes. And now this stuff, for the most part, is so soft, it's not a problem. This area right here was almost completely bare when we first moved in here. We amp grazed it several times through here over the last few years. And look at how thick this is. You can barely walk through this now. Look at this stuff. And we've already grazed it once, and it's already come back. God's been very graceful to us this year with all the rain. And on top of that rain, our amp grazing practices are really, really helping us out. So we're able to catch all that rain in the soil and not just watch it run off. There's a little creek that runs through here into these trees, and then it runs down here. And the first several times I saw that running, it was a muddy mess. It looked terrible, watching all the soil just run off. And the amount of water that ran through there just from a little bit of rain was crazy. Now it rarely ever even fills up. There's so much more water that infiltrates into the soil and just absorbs down into the ground rather than just running off into this little creek. It's awesome. And the other thing I've noticed is there is hardly any sediment running off into that creek anymore. So our topsoil is staying where it's at. You don't get much better than that. That's some really good evidence of the benefits of amp grazing. There's our two new summer lambs. We got Doc Brown and Marty McFly there. My daughter loves Back to the Future, so she got to name them. But that's pretty neat. It's our first set of summer lambs. So these ewes are going to spend just a little bit more time in here. I'm getting ready to set them up a new paddock, and that's the way of amp grazing. Now we call it lean grazing here because we do it a little bit differently than a lot of people. We don't have tractors, we don't have a perimeter fence, we don't have a barn. We just have the sheep buckets and some electric sheep net, and we've been getting along just fine now for a few years. It's working pretty good. It's definitely got its challenges like everything does, but it's got a learning curve, but once you get it down, it's awesome. And the minimum cost to get into it, you know, it really allows a lot more people to get into something like this than what you'd think if you wanted to start a little grazing project. You definitely need some land though. But they're going to be moving on to this stuff right here. Lots of clover, lots of different kinds of grass. It's definitely not a monoculture. It's not a static feed. We offer them a really diverse menu. So they're getting all different kinds of nutrition. Every time we move them to a new area, they're getting another mineral that they might have been lacking. And one of the main benefits for them and for the land is they're not going to go back to this spot. They're not going to be back in here where all this manure is at and where they've already grazed. So the possibility of them overgrazing a plant, you know, after they've already chomped on a plant, once it starts to regrow, that immediate regrowth, if they bite it again, that's going to be considered overly grazed. And it really sets the plants back. So you don't want to do that. You want to get them onto something new. So that's what we do here. They're on to new forage all the time. They don't spend more than one day or even less eating in a certain area. They're always on new forage. So they cannot reinfect themselves with parasites. And they can't overgraze. Right, girls? That's right.